Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 107 of the podcast. In today's episode, I talk with Steve Cullum, student pastor, and we talk about students' mental health and some things he and his wife have done and leaned into and even trained their team to help with students who have been dealing with mental health issues. And especially as we talk about, you just get a sense, and you probably already know this, for how widespread it is. I'll never forget reading that stat not too many years ago that the average high school student has as much anxiety and stress and depression as the average person who was maybe admitted in a mental hospital 50, 60 years ago. So certainly there's lots of pressure that students are dealing with, and we talk about that and kind of their unique heart from passion to help students with that, how they did that at the church they were in New England. And then now Steve recently has moved to a church in Colorado. And so he talks about the different contexts there, how they're different but also the same. And then we also talk about what student ministry was like in New England at that church that was about 350 in size, and then at his church now in Colorado that is much larger, over 2,000. Yet the student ministries were actually the same when he left the one and showed up at the other. There were differences for sure, but in terms of the size of the many ministries. So we talk a little bit about scaling a ministry. What does that look like in 1 year at his new church? How has he helped build up some consistency and some momentum? I think there's some great practical tips in there that you're going to love. And as usual, you can get all the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 107. Steve did email me some things that we talked about, and we put that in the show notes so you can look for that crisis protocol information, and as well as some other links that he shared that I thought were really, really helpful. So whether you serve in student ministry or not, I think you'll enjoy this interview. It's really insightful, and I just love Steve and his wife's heart for students, and especially students who are struggling with any mental health issues. And he even tells a couple stories about students who have been through his ministry and now are adults, and how that has helped them. And even still to this day, even though he's moved, they stay connected. So I love the conversation with Steve. He also hosts a podcast. We talk about that. So if you serve in student ministry, you're going to want to check that out. Let's go ahead now and listen to my interview with Steve Cullum about students' mental health and scaling a ministry. Well, today I'm talking with fellow podcaster Steve Cullum. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Thanks, Nick.
Tell us about you and your family and your church and your podcast. Give us just an introduction to who you are and what church you're at and your family and the podcast that you started pretty recently, right?
Yeah, a couple years ago. Yeah. So, I'm a first generation, I guess, minister. No one else in my family ever worked in pastoral ministry. My grandfather was a huge volunteer in the church and had to kind of set my thoughts and my path that direction, and thought I was going to be like very similar to him. Kind of just, very heavily involved volunteer. And then God had some other plans. And so grew up in southern Illinois in a little town called West Frankfort. And while I was there, influenced by the church, grew up in the church, and eventually got involved in a youth group when I was in high school, and just fell in love with it, and got some opportunities from my youth pastor to volunteer and do some different things within the children's ministry and the youth group. And then God led me to go ahead and pursue that in college. So I went to Lincoln Christian, what was then college, now university, in Lincoln, Illinois, and I got my bachelor's in youth ministry, and then immediately went into seminary and studied mostly counseling, youth and family counseling, and got my master's of arts there. And then after doing some ministry and school and everything in Illinois, God grabbed my heart for New England, took me out to New England, did ministry there for 10 years, married my wife, who I met in Illinois, and we both moved out there to New Hampshire for 10 years. And then last year, God brought me out to Longmont, Colorado, which is where I've been for the last 11 months, doing ministry here at LifeBridge Christian Church. And like you said, I also do a podcast. Been doing what's called the Student Ministry Podcast. for the last couple of years. And it really stemmed out of me having a love for hearing stories. And that's basically what that podcast is all about, is stories. And so I bring on other student pastors and I just ask about the story. Nick, what's God been doing in their life? What's their ministry look like? And then we share some tips and tricks that they've learned along the way. And it's great. It's a monthly podcast. It's basically all I can keep up with right now. I'd love to do more, but we do just a monthly schedule. And it's been awesome to connect with youth pastors across the country and even a couple out of Canada. So we're like international now. So
international, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great. I love podcasts. Obviously, I'm biased, but I listen to a ton. I always tell people I basically have 3 categories. I've got like church, business, and NFL. Those are my 3
nice.
My 3 categories of podcasts. And the NFL one has certain seasons to it. So really just, I kind of load up, like I feel like that ended. And now I've just been binging on ministry podcasts, a little bit of business. Haven't listened to that as much. More, and that's more leadership for me. And, but I just love podcasts, and I love it for the same thing you're doing. Just hearing other people's stories. What's going on in their life? What are some tips? What are some tricks? What are some things that they've learned, which is great. And it feels like, I mean, podcasts have been around for a while. But like yours, mine, a lot of them in the ministry space feel like they're 3 years old, if they're old, if they're old. Yep. Some of them are, 6 months old or whatever, but it's cool. It's cool to see such a good influx of podcasts. So you mentioned, you got your master's in youth and family counseling, and that's something that you're passionate about, that your wife's passionate about. Tell us about your passion there, especially mental health as it relates to student ministry and the story behind that.
Yeah. So I think it probably all starts back when I was near my 4 years. We were wrapping up in Bible college and I was taking some counseling classes, and I was just a part of the required, degree, and I didn't really think much about it. I knew that counseling had a role within ministry, but I really didn't think much, beyond that. I knew that I needed to be a better listener, and that's kind of how I went into that class. And then all of a sudden, I remember very vividly one day that because I didn't really take abnormal psychology or anything like this, so a lot of the thoughts that we were sharing that day and my professor was sharing in class were really brand new thoughts to me, that people are they have to go through life suffering with all these different mental illnesses. And he was just telling me about some very practical life situations that he's had with other clients and stuff in his office. And all of a sudden I remember, just hearing these stories, and I remember, him sharing the idea that, we have the answer as Christians, as Christ followers, as leaders within the church. We have the answer that a lot of these people need, is a relationship with Jesus. And a lot of times we feel like we're like throwing Band-Aids at gaping wounds a lot of times, if we don't introduce Jesus in there. And I remember writing in my notes that day, very large on my piece of paper, just like, I want to be a counselor. And it didn't mean that I felt God was necessarily calling me out of ministry into counseling, but I started to see my role as a youth pastor differently that day, that it wasn't just I'm leading games and sharing Jesus with people, which is incredibly important, obviously the most important thing. But I felt like God was asking me to go deeper than just the surface level of youth ministry. And so that day I decided I was already thinking about seminary. And that day I decided that was going to be my focus in seminary as I pursued my master's degree. And so that was really cool. I loved it the whole time. Lo and behold, I hadn't met my wife yet, but she was finishing up her degree at a state school and feeling like she was getting called into ministry as well, and felt a very similar call and to go to seminary and also study counseling. And so we met at church before that, had a lot of shared interest in everything and shared passion around that. And like I said, we ended up getting married, and it's been awesome to bring our passions together around that and see what God's continuing to do. So when I moved out to New England, I just started seeing the world a little differently, and started seeing that God has been really absent, I think, from a lot of activity in New England. A lot of the different polls and results and everything will show you that New England is very much one of the most unchristian, if not the most unchristian parts of the country. And so we were seeing the results of that. We're starting to see, a lot more depression and suicide and just mental illness going crazy. And it's just like everywhere around us. And my wife ended up getting a job in the mental health field. So she worked for just a little over 7 years in the mental health field, the secular side of things. And then we kind of combined efforts within the church and a little outside the church as well. And it's been the same thing. It's one of the things that actually called us to, I feel like, that God used to call us to Colorado now is also the rampant depression and suicide and other tragedies that northern Colorado has been going through as well. So it's very much in our face. It's something that now my family has been going through with mental illness and everything as well. So I feel like, God clearly knew what he was doing when he said, "Hey, I want you to study this in seminary," because it's not just "Hey, I want to be a better listener," which is awesome. I think it's incredibly important for any pastor out there to be a better listener. But like he knew what he was going to be putting us, in that populations we were going to be working with over time. And it's awesome to look back and go, "Oh, okay, God had this whole plan figured out," and I just knew the little snippet of it at the time.
So when you arrived there in New England, and you've got this passion, you have this training now, what were some of the things that you saw in your own youth ministry, maybe even outside that too, in schools and things like that, that just reminded you of how important this was? Because I want to hear about what you did in response, but tell us some of the things that you saw in your own ministry or maybe in the schools that those kids were in. Yeah.
I think probably one of the first experiences I had was one of my students who was in middle school, and he's one of my really I would consider him now, because he's in his 20s and long gone out of youth group himself, and he's one of my really good friends now. But when he was in middle school and I was just starting fresh there, I remember him going through some tragedy with his family. He was losing. I think he lost a grandparent. I think it was his grandfather. Like soon after I got there, and have all this education in my head and mentoring from other youth pastors and stuff that I worked with on internships and residencies and all this stuff. And the biggest thing that stuck in my head that I had no idea what to really do in that moment. But I remember just echoes of professors and mentors saying, just be present. And so I go to his funeral, and I had no idea what to do, what to say. I barely knew the family. But I just wanted to be present. And man, that went so far. Just to be there with them, not having the words to say, but just being there to be a shoulder to cry on, to listen if they did need to talk about something. But a lot of times I just stood there, or I just sat there. And that I think was the first step in so many. And so when this same guy started going through some pretty serious depression and anxiety disorders later on, just like maybe the next year or so, and he ended up in the mental health hospitals and the regular hospitals because he was thinking about suicide and all these different things. I was also there with him in the hospital, talking with his parents. We developed a really strong relationship. And at that point, his parents were in contact with me. I was in contact with them pretty much all the time, and constantly working on some things that could really help him, try to keep him involved in that everything. So yeah, he dealt with some really significant things, and like I said, he's still alive and well and pursuing ministry to this day. And it's been really cool to see what God did through that whole thing. But he's just one example of probably, I don't even know. Unfortunately, there was a lot of other ones that we had worked with out there. And I think one of the other ones that pops in my head is a girl that had a really rough home life. So this other guy had his parents were together and they were trying to do their best, and he was just struggling. This other girl didn't have that at all. Her parents were split, really rough home life. Stepdad was not very nice to her at all. And so she had a lot of situation in her life that kind of pointed to, like, if you were like, the guy probably think, oh wow, that's kind of odd that he would end up in that situation. This girl, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because she's got a lot of things going against her. But it was, again, another situation where we were able to step in. And so this time my wife, being a female, was able to really pour in, and I did as well, but being able to come alongside her and try to figure out like what is helpful, because a lot of times what happened, she'd get into youth group and especially small group, and like one thing would trigger her and she'd be like crying and storming out of the room. Like, what is going on? And so we try to just understand her story and step into her life, and eventually figured out, okay, so for her, my wife ended up meeting with her like a half an hour or so, just grabbing coffee before youth group started every week. And that allowed her to get all her thoughts and anxieties and things out in the open before she stepped into youth group. And then she was able to really be a vital part of her small group and participate and listen a lot better. And so it was a lot about just learning her story and learning what worked for her situation. And we had so many other situations. I've still got another one of the students from there still Instagram like direct messaged me like just the other day and said, he's got people bullying him at school and his pet just died and all these different things. And he's just like, what do I do? How do I do this? And so that's pretty much like what we were surrounded with, like, was just students that are struggling with a lot of stuff and just not really sure how to deal with it.
Yeah. And all the studies and research today would tell you that all of that's more rampant. So social media has made people less connected, but more anxious and depressed and alone.
Right.
Which, I mean, again, is obvious because social media isn't actually connecting you. It's, in some ways, there's ways it can be good, like the direct message you all are sending back and forth Instagram, but in a lot of ways they're alone. How, so you all obviously had the training, very passionate about it, you and your wife. How did you help like your ministry volunteers step into those conversations and those moments as well? Because I know that's something that people listening are thinking is maybe, they're equipped or they feel equipped to do that, but their volunteers might not. So how did you help your volunteers serve students in a good way through those kind of situations?
Right. Yeah. I think the biggest thing was helping them to open their eyes to see that really it wasn't just the students that who are actually diagnosed with mental illness. Like, for the most part, like every student is struggling, especially with social media. It does play a lot into it. And I think just the anxieties, the pressures of the world today are just huge. And we saw that especially in New England, being a very academic part of our country. We were on the outskirts of Boston, and there's just so many colleges and universities and people coming to get trained and go and change the world around them. But they had these expectations, and some of them were healthy, some of them were very unhealthy. And because of those expectations that were placed on them, pretty much every student in our youth group was struggling with some sort of anxiety. Anxiety to succeed, anxiety to live up to these expectations and all that sort of thing. So the biggest thing that we did in the beginning was just to kind of open their eyes to that and just see, it's not just the ones that actually have clinical depression. It's also these students that they're like, straight A students. And they're also struggling because they feel like they have to perform, and helping them through that as well. So not only just kind of open their eyes, but also we leaned upon a lot of resources that were already out there. So Orange has some like one-page resources that just say, what to say and what not to say and how to respond in a tragedy. They've been really good about also having, like with the school shootings and things like that, they've been putting out some series that they have to walk through with your leaders, but also your students. And so we use those as well, and really just kind of try to put a lot of resources in their hands. But we also did some training. So I partnered with some of the local organizations in our community, the mental health organizations, and we had a couple different workshops to kind of bring people in, bring experts in. And so we talked a little bit about it from a ministry's perspective, but we also have professional counselors and mental health experts come in and say, okay, here's some things that you need to know about mental illness, but here's some things that you can do on a regular basis. Here's when you need to refer out, and all those sort of things, just walking through that with them. And so, not only did we do internal training on our own through our education, our experience and everything, but, one of the biggest things was partnering with the local organizations, both Christian and non-Christian, to come in and say, hey, how can you train our leaders to be better at just knowing what to do when this sort of a situation comes up. And I think probably the last thing I'd mention is to have some sort of a protocol is incredibly important. So we sat together to try to figure out what kind of crisis protocol should we have in our student ministry. And a lot of them can look similar across the board, but some of them need to be specific for your context and everything. And so I think that was incredibly important for us to sit down and talk about. So if a student comes to you and says they are struggling with depression or they are struggling with suicide, what is the protocol? What kind of steps do we go through in order to help the student? And that helps, I think, a lot of our leaders just feel at ease, because a lot of them didn't have the same education that we did. They didn't have the experience in it, but they cared for students. And as soon as we said, here's the step-by-step process in an ideal situation, that helped them take a big breath of fresh air, and they're like, okay, I can do this. And it helped them feel a little more comfortable in the situation.
If that's something that you could share, if there was a document that outlined your crisis protocol, I'm sure people would love to have that. So, I'm just thinking about folks that want to do the same thing you did, pass that on to volunteers, get it in some kind of written format or whatever, so it's consistent. By all means, we'd love to see that if you can share it. How did you talked a little bit, obviously, about how you've helped students and even maybe their parents, but what are some other things you did to help families and students themselves through the ministry? Did parents attend some of those trainings when you brought?
Yeah,
that's what I figured.
Yeah, that was something that we really tried to really implement. It wasn't just a leader thing. Because, if you're familiar with Orange, which I know you are, Nick, parents have the most influence on their students. And so we wanted to not only make sure that parents were trained, we also wanted to make sure that students were trained. And so some of those workshops we purposely invited our leaders, our parents, and our students to all take part in it. And so we had some talks that were just in general stuff, and then we had some breakouts that were specific to parents, specific to leaders, specific to students, and we even split up middle school, high school, because they're dealing with some different situations in there. And so we wanted to be kind of contextualize some of the things that we taught them along the way as well. So not only do we teach about it in youth group, but we also had these intensive days where we really said, okay, we know this is an issue in our community, and we want to address it head on. And so that was a lot of the ways that we actually partnered with the local organizations, and it was very helpful. And it's something that I'm hoping to do and implement here in Colorado now as well. There's a lot more resources that we have around us, and so I'm trying to still learn what all those are, but it's incredibly important, I think, to not only help our leaders, but also help parents, because they're on the front lines with these students, and they're dealing with it. And I think, like people said a lot of times, parenting doesn't come with a handbook and everything before you become a parent. You try to figure it out along the way. And so we want to really partner with our parents and say, here's some things that your student may be struggling with, or maybe most likely their friend is struggling with. And here's how you can be a parent. Here's how you can be a parent, a helpful person to your kids' friends. And we also made sure we really leaned into students, because they're even more on the front lines. They're walking through the school halls and seeing, people passing them by who are just struggling with just huge things in their life. And I know a lot of them, at least our students, were going, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to really, I know I need to do something, but what do I do? And so we focused a lot on trying to train them in peer counseling as well. And so we led some workshops at some different student leadership things and some student ministry workshops at conferences and things like that around that as well. Just to try to widen the awareness of mental illness, and then kind of come up with some basic steps that pretty much everybody can do, even if you're not a professional, mental health counselor, that you can actually do. And then one of the biggest things was to be able to put resources in people's hands. So students, parents, leaders' hands, and say, here are the people that you can refer to, you can contact when you get in a situation. So coming up with a contact list and saying, here's the hotlines, here's the mental health, emergency numbers, here's, the counselors that are connected with our church, here's, all the different resources that we have in terms of people, that as soon as it gets beyond what you can do, here's how you can start contacting these other people to come alongside and help you.
Now, what would you say context was like as it relates to mental health in New England versus now that you've been in Colorado almost a year.
Yeah, it's actually it's one of the things that drew us to Colorado, and as a matter of fact, so it's very, as I said, it's I feel like it was very rampant in New England, and I probably saw it a lot more than some people because my wife was in the mental health field for so long. And so I heard all the stories, and I heard what was going on, and a lot of it was in, both professional stuff, but we had a large population of homeless people who were struggling with it. And a lot of times that's why they ended up homeless, because they were struggling with mental illness. And so it was very, very prominent there. And one of the things that I heard about, Northern Colorado specifically, where we are, I mean, there's, you have the school shootings that have happened over time, Columbine, Littleton, and things like that, here. And I feel like it's just stayed. Like there's like, I don't know, to get too spiritual here, but I feel like there's kind of I don't know, there's a very spiritually dark place at times. And I think a lot of people are still struggling with some of those things. It's a very it's the reality for them that they've lived through some of these horrible tragedies right in their backyard. And then there's other things that I don't quite understand yet, but there's a community, right beside us that has had, in 11 months that I've been here, they've had, I think 5 or 6 really big tragedies. Whether it be, a couple months ago, they had, one of their beloved, guys that just graduated high school like a year or two ago who, ended up dying and serving our country, overseas. And so that was a pretty big hit for the community. Just a few months ago, they had, a suicide in one of the schools. Right after I got here, there was a horrible, dirt biking accident where a high school student died. And then they've had some other really big, scares with either shootings or bombings and different things like that. And so, I mean, it's very rampant here. And, it's one of the reasons that I think, attracted us to it when we started hearing about that, and that God used to really break our hearts for Colorado. Cause we didn't realize, to be honest, I knew a lot about New England because I'd taken mission trips out there when I was in college, and I knew the spiritual state of New England, but I had no clue that, especially Northern Colorado, was in a very similar place. And so our lead pastor, Rick Rusaw at LifeBridge, here in Colorado is, probably most famous for his book, The Externally Focused Church. And so he talked about, right after that I had moved here, we had the conversation about how the most, non-Christian county in, America, they have all these different polls and everything to figure those things out. And apparently, the county that I was serving in New Hampshire and the county that I'm currently in Northern Colorado were tied for first. And so wow. I've definitely have a huge heart for non-Christians. I grew up in the Bible Belt, but man, I want to, there's so much tragedy and need and struggle out there that God has just kind of grabbed my heart, and he keeps taking me to these places where, I'm just surrounded by it. But it's awesome to be able to be in places where, man, you actually see some of the fruit of what you're doing, because it's making a pretty significant difference. And maybe they don't know Jesus yet, and we're gonna eventually get there to really change their spiritual lives. But being able to even just save people from some depression, some deep depression, and some suicidal thoughts and actions and things like that, we're able to make a huge impact.
You mentioned how, the Northeast, much more unchurched. I think Vermont continues to lead the country in least churched state, in the country. And I'm in Maryland, so we're kind of mid-Atlantic, but we're certainly more like Northeast than the South. But we are sort of in the middle. There's things about this culture that are different from what I know of New England. And my own personal take on it is, the farther north you go, the less church it gets, into Canada and everything. Yep. And so it's just different, I visited Carrie Newhoff's church before and talk with them about their setting and how difficult that is. But how, in terms of this mental health and your role in the church, how has that played into how people get help or don't get help? I mean, are there more places that are doing better work from, the Christian standpoint out there in Colorado than there were in New England? Or is it, maybe there's more people in New England, and maybe they're less church, but other than that, it's the same issues. So it actually feels the same, I guess is what I'm wondering. Like, how does the church presence in Colorado versus the church presence in New England impact it or not? Yeah,
I think it's interesting to think as I'm processing that question. I think the overall state is very similar. So like the amount of mental health issues that are present in New England, I think I'm seeing very similar, maybe even a little more in Colorado. However, like you said, there's a more, I don't know, what I'm seeing, at least in northern Colorado, is that there are more larger established churches here. So in a way, there's some more Christian influence, but I haven't necessarily seen that it's made a significant impact yet. I think there's a lot of people poised to help, but I think, and actually what I think part of what God is really wanting to do is to bring some of those resources together. And how can we band together? Because I think we've all been doing it in our own little communities and doing great at it. But I think is going to be so much more possibility once we start coming together and start partnering together and really pulling our resources and people and everything and start to really make an impact together. Because I think in New England there wasn't as much of a church presence, and it was very much felt. But what was there, we realized we had to pull together because there weren't very many of us. And so a lot of times we're overwhelmed. There was a lot more work than what we were actually capable of doing a lot of times. It was very difficult sometimes to find a Christian counselor for a student that I felt very confident in, that didn't have an already like really, really, really filled like calendar with so many other appointments throughout the week. And so I think a lot of the workers in New England were just overworked because there just wasn't that many of them. So that need is still there. I think what we have in Colorado is a lot of resources, and probably very similar to what Jesus was telling his disciples. Say the fields are ripe for harvest, but the workers are few. And not necessarily the workers are few, but I think we haven't really like been deployed in the right way, if you know what I'm saying. And so like, I feel like if we can really create some energy around coming together and really making an impact, I feel very confident that things will be changed here in this part of the country. But it's going to take us coming together, because there's definitely a very present, spiritual darkness over a lot of communities in Colorado.
Yeah, and you mentioned like there was a lot of work to do. Some of that, the difference between the church in New England and the church in other areas of the country, and then there's some similarities in the Northwest, right? If you go Northwest, a lot of those areas are similar church-wise to the Northeast, but the population is so big in the Northeast,
right?
Like Massachusetts has more people than Colorado,
yep.
Despite the fact that it's this tiny little thing. And what that means is with fewer churches, fewer large churches, smaller churches, you're right, there's just more work to do than there probably are churches and Christians to jump in
yep.
and help. So I wanted to talk about, kind of change gears and talk about, going from your church in New England to Colorado, and there are different size churches, different contexts, different parts of the country. And as it relates to student ministry, I thought it'd be helpful for us to sort of unpack that, and what are you learning and what's different. And so we've talked about the different contexts of those two towns, but tell us about the two churches that you served in, and what were they like? What was your church out in New England like? What's LifeBridge like in terms of the church and the student ministry? And then let's dive in about like what some of the differences and what you're learning. So tell us about those two churches and the kind of the distinctions.
Sure.
And similarities.
Yeah. So the biggest distinction is that they are almost like where they're both Christian churches. So in the Restoration Movement church, I guess, world. But other than that, pretty much night and day in difference. So Rockingham Christian Church that I served at in New Hampshire was about 6 years old. They started in 2001, so they were about 6 when I came on board in 2007, and I was able to start the youth ministry from scratch. And so they had a very, very small volunteer-led youth group when I came on board, middle school and high school together, and just doing what they could from volunteers at a new church, which is awesome. I love that there was something to start with. But it was basically starting from scratch. And so I was able to build the team up over time and see it grow. And it's really awesome. And then, so the church itself, when I left, our average attendance was probably somewhere, it was in the 300s, to 400s. And so it kind of gives you a context a little bit for that community and that church. And then, God takes me out to Colorado to serve in a church that is 127 years old and very established in the community. In fact, depending on who you ask, I think the church may be older than the town itself. Which is just crazy. It's always been there. Yeah. And it has a history of being very present in the community and present in the church world. A lot of youth pastors came before me. In the very recent years, there's a lot of turnover. And so I think, depending on who you ask and what, research you look at, the average youth minister will stay at a church for somewhere between 18 months to 3 years. And so that's what they were seeing in the last several years, here at LifeBridge. And so there's a lot of, stuff that just comes from that, from a lot of turnover in the last several years and, coming into an established, but kind of, I wouldn't say broken, but there was definitely some areas of the youth group that needed to be fixed and tweaked and helped along in order to get it to the place where it really should be. And so, in terms of context, like other than the people and the culture itself, which is very similar, from New England to Northern Colorado, everything else about the churches were almost vastly different.
Yeah. Now you started at Rockingham and it was, just a handful of students. You left and it was, 65 or 70 students or something maybe that were part of the ministry?
Yeah.
So for a church of 350, that's excellent. That's most churches get maybe 10%, of their average attendance in student ministry. So 35 would have been very common. Right. But then you go to LifeBridge, larger church, but like you're saying, the student ministry had some turnover and wasn't, thriving at that point. How many students were maybe involved regularly then when you got there?
Yeah, it was probably about the same size, maybe just a little less than what we were reaching there in New Hampshire. And actually, so even though the church was a lot bigger, we're depending on what week and everything. People travel so much more in Colorado because of, Rocky Mountains and everything. So, people are in the church is a lot less, but our average attendance is probably somewhere in the 2,500 range overall. And, the youth group was running about 65, 70 students. So very similar numbers to what we were looking at Rockingham. Yeah.
I mean, the church is, getting close to 10 times the size. It's not quite, but it's like 8 times, 7, 8 times the size, has the same number of students. This isn't uncommon. I've worked with a number of churches where, despite being a larger church, they don't necessarily have that participation in student ministry or kids ministry. Sometimes you see that in kids ministry too.
Yep.
But obviously a lot of times in a larger church like that, the potential's there. The families are there. The students are there somewhere. They're just not in the program. So tell us a little bit about, it's been a year now and it has grown. So tell us about like a couple of the changes you made in this year, how it's structured and sort of the path you're on to help it get back to a healthy place.
Sure. So, coming out of Bible college and all these different trainings and books and stuff I read, pretty much all the experts in youth ministry say don't change things, especially big things when you first get to a church. So I changed things, and I wasn't really excited about it. I was excited about the outcome, but I wasn't excited about doing it right at the very beginning, but I felt it was something that really needed to happen. And so the biggest change that we made was that they were running middle school and high school together on Sunday morning. And at a large church with that many resources and that many students, it was like, we really need to get these students separated so we can really, teach each of them in their own context with middle school and high school. And so what I actually did wasn't completely change things. I actually, rotated the clock back a little bit, because they used to do middle school on Sunday morning and high school on Sunday evenings. And so I basically implemented that back again. And so a lot of families were just like, oh, okay, like it used to be. I was like, yeah, like it used to be. And so it wasn't like a drastic as a change as it could have been, because they had experienced that before. And they were experiencing growth the last time it was doing that as well. And so that change alone, all of a sudden made middle schoolers more excited about going to a middle school thing, and made high schoolers excited about going to a high school thing. And we almost saw double attendance from high school almost immediately, because they had their own thing. They didn't have to hang out with the young middle schoolers anymore. And so, we probably saw about 25-30% or more attendance boost as soon as we did that. And we started seeing a lot more consistency as well. Overall, like I said, people travel a lot in both New England and Colorado, but we've done some research, and we were seeing that the average attendance for a worship service, and it was very present in youth group as well, was about 0.8 times a month. So less than once a month that most families were coming. And I need to actually finish the research for student ministry. I know our numbers overall have been going up as a church, so I think we're probably at once a month now, maybe a little higher than that. So overall, we're doing really well. But anecdotally, I know that our youth group is probably, our attendance, our consistency is more like 3/4 of the month. So 3 out of 4 times a month, we're seeing the same students over and over again. So that's been huge to see that consistency. And
that's great.
That's been helpful for small groups to like grow relationships and continue thoughts from one week to the next. And actually like they can bring their friends because they know those same people are going to be there the next week, and they can introduce them to people. Just like that's been huge. Not only increasing numbers, but consistency has been the biggest thing that I'm excited about, because they're continuing to come back week after week, and we're seeing new friends week after week.
And so the student ministries were, close to the same size. Churches obviously weren't. So what were some of the distinctions or the differences between leading in those two different churches? What did you have to do differently? What was the same? Because a lot of times we think it's different, and I think there are, churches that are different sizes are quite different, but there's a lot that's the same. A lot of it's just how you do it. So what were some differences?
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of times I went to conferences year after year, and I hear these people from large churches and go, how am I going to implement that thing in my church of 200 people? Like that, it just doesn't, I can't wrap my head around it. But now actually being in both those situations, I think the biggest thing is the similarity between them is that it's still the same. We're still reaching teenagers and families for Jesus. And the biggest difference is really just scale. Like going through trying to figure out like how to lead a lot more students, a lot bigger team through all this sort of thing. I have a staff now of paid workers that I work with, and I'm now going through the process of trying to hire some additional people on our team. And so those are new things that I never had to deal with or go through at a smaller church. But I did have to do that with volunteers. Like I wanted to bring on some more volunteers. I interviewed them, and especially when we started layering, we talked about this on our Orange podcast a few weeks ago, that this was a big theme at the Orange Conference this year, was this idea of like layering leadership and putting all these places, these roles in place to really scale the ministry and grow it over time. And so as the ministry was growing in New England, I was putting these things in place already. It looked a little different, but it scaled to the same thing I'm now doing in Colorado. It's just in a much, much larger scale, because we do have resources and we have people and I have staff now, but the basic idea is really the same. Other things that a lot of small church ministers probably don't realize that large church ministers have to deal with is processes and paperwork and figuring out like, how do I, fill out this one thing in order to get all these different things done. Like when I was in a small church, like I had a good idea or what I thought was a good idea. I maybe went and talked to my senior pastor, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's cool. Let's go for it." Or sometimes he trusted me and just run with it on my own. Now I have all these different like paths and processes to go through, and I got to fill out this paperwork and talk to this person. They got to talk to this one. I got to schedule the rooms. I got to do all these different things that actually are sometimes a hindrance to ministry happening. And sometimes I do think back, I'm like, man, it was so much easier when I was at the small church, and I wanted to use the church. I just used it because like that was all we had to do. But now I gotta through like 5 different systems in order to schedule one room for this extra thing that we're doing this week.
What's interesting is I was thinking you would kind of touch on that as we talked, before we recorded, because on one hand, that is necessary for any organization to grow, right? You got to have systems, you got to make things consistent. And some of it just comes down to working as a team. We were having this conversation this week, somebody on our staff, of how like if you were a leader that largely did a lot of the things yourself and had some volunteers help you, and you just kind of did your own thing because that's the size or whatever just allowed you to do that, well, then that's easier than it is to work with a team where now you got to share a space and communicate about things that you never used to have to communicate about, and go through processes like you're talking about that you never had to go through before. But the reality is too, though, that in a church or in a business, if you get too much of that, it kills the organization. So it's like that perfect balance of like systematized where, things work and are consistent and everything works together, but not overly done so that it's red tape, bureaucratic, slowing things down way too much, and you lose all of the vision and the risk taking and the ideas, So, I mean, I know I'm sort of like asking you to talk about your church openly on a podcast, but how have you navigated that new world of those systems and policies? And do you feel like you've figured it out in a way that you can still, lead and create and do all of those things? Like, don't let the one die just to get the other.
Right. Yeah. To be honest, I'm still trying to figure it out. I think it's going to be, in some ways, a lifelong pursuit to try to figure that out. Because I think as people change and as culture changes, we got to go back and revisit those things a lot. And so I think one of the things that I've realized about myself is that I am kind of a change oriented person, in ways that things that I think need to change. I'm kind of a catalyst for that. And so, conversations that we have, actually with our executive who's over family ministry, we have conversations quite often and are like, okay, I know this is the way that we have been doing it, but can there be a better way? Can there be a new strategy? Can we tweak the one we have now in order to make sure that it doesn't hinder our ministry? Like, cause some of these things are incredibly important and they have to be done, like you said. But can we make them better in order to not hinder our ministry now and in the future? And how can we scale them and so it doesn't become overwhelming? And so, yeah, we haven't figured it out yet. But I think it's, in some ways it's a lifelong pursuit, but I'm definitely feeling a lot more comfortable now than what I did when I first came on board. It was really overwhelming in the beginning. There was a lot of times that I went to our family pastor at that time, and like the first few weeks, I'm like, oh, I just wish I could just tell teenagers about Jesus again, because that was easy, compared to all this other stuff that I have to do now. But I think it was for me, it was about the 6-month mark, was when I all of a sudden felt a lot more comfortable in this new church, and the relationships were there, and all of a sudden now I didn't feel like hindered by things, that I now felt like either I can use them to the best ability, or that I can actually start implementing a little bit of change in order to make them better for student ministry and possibly for the church as a whole.
How about, it's been 1 year, so you've had some changes, you split middle school, high school. You've seen some momentum. I think you said it went from like 60 to 70 attending students to 110-ish. That's some good momentum, some good growth there. Is there anything else that you've changed or put in place in the year that you think has helped, build that momentum and that consistency?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I implemented was regular meeting times with our team. They didn't really feel like when I came on board, 2 things really stood out to me, that they felt like they weren't really heard and that they weren't really utilized. And so, we have some amazing leaders, Nick. Like, I stepped into this ministry, like, even though some things were kind of chaotic, we have some small group leaders that have been serving for 20, 25, 30 years. And wow. It's just a wealth of experience there that some of these, like, they've been serving in student ministry almost longer than I've been alive. And like, there's so much experience and wisdom there. So number one, I've been trying to lean into those relationships as much as possible. And some of those people, like there's a couple that I'm thinking of that all of their experience has been at LifeBridge. And so they not only know students, they know students in this community, and they've been working with these families. And now they're seeing, like, turnover from generation to generation, and that's church. And so, number one, I wanted to lean in to them and make sure that they feel heard, but also that they were feeling utilized. And so, one of the biggest things was just really leaning into our volunteers that were already there and just saying, hey, I want you to take this and run with it. This ministry is not just mine, by any means. It is ours together. And so, I've been working a lot with the team itself, and part of that was implementing just monthly meetings. And we've tried to simplify them as much as possible because people's schedules are crazy, and I want to honor them. So we do like 1 hour meetings once a month, the first Sunday of the month. We'll meet after church. I give them some lunch, and we talk about some training stuff. We plan for the future, and then we pray together. And it's been awesome just to see that it's not a huge radical, like, oh my gosh, that's never been done before sort of thing, but it's really worked to bring our team together. And all of a sudden they feel more capable and energized to go out and do the ministry from week to week.
So I think there's something you said in there that I don't want anybody to miss. You talked to and you listened to the leaders who were there, which is important. Sometimes there's this tendency, if you're stepping into a new role, to be like, well, you all have been here, so if it's not working, you're part of the problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And let me just tell you what you need to do.
Yeah.
But instead, you were smart. You listened. And sure enough, they had, good thoughts, good advice. When you say you meet monthly, is it like everyone or just some key volunteers, like a leadership team almost, or is it all of them, all the volunteers?
Right now, it's all of them. Yeah. So our staff, which is currently just 2 people, we meet on a weekly basis, and eventually that will grow to 3 or 4, as we do find these other positions we're looking for. So that's a weekly meeting, that we're talking about the ins and outs, the leadership stuff. And we do bring, some key volunteers into that conversation on a regular basis. But that monthly meeting is pretty much all of our small group leaders. It doesn't do the far outreaching to like our teaching rotation and the people that kind of just help on trips or things like that, kind of the lower commitment level roles within our student ministry team. But it's primarily like pretty much every middle school and small group leader, middle school, high school, small group leader.
That's great. And they're doing it. They're showing up. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they're buying in and they're passionate about it, which is really cool.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest things is to really, if you're having regular meetings, to honor people's time. When I told them, it was like, hey, it's just an hour. I'll feed you. I'm going to make it really simple. I'm going to make it worth your while. Then we've actually started seeing more consistency in those meetings, because of those things. Because if you're wasting people's time, no one's going to show up. But if you actually make it worth their while and concise and feed them, it does actually get your team there.
What have you been doing with them? Like, is it like a mix of training, feedback, discussion, evaluation? It is,
yeah. So I basically come up with a pretty simple 3-part process for our meetings. So we talk about training, we plan together, and we pray. So train, plan, pray is our order pretty much every time, and food is kind of worked in there. So, but yeah, we read and now are leaning upon Download Youth Ministry. So it's a great organization. Doug Fields and Josh Griffin have put together some awesome resources along with like so many other youth workers across the country and around the world. And so we lean upon their video trainings. And so right now I basically send out a video training ahead of time. So we do like the whole flip the classroom kind of idea. And I'll send it out about a week ahead of time. It's like a 10-minute training video. And I say, watch it on your own time, take some notes, and come in ready to spend about 15, 20 minutes or so at the beginning of our meeting dissecting and discussing what you learned at, through that training video. And that's been some great times. Like, some of them are like, which I try to vary them based on what we need each month, but also just to kind of get them thinking about different aspects of ministry. So this last one, we actually talked a lot more about our own childhood and what the role that maybe student ministry played in our own roles, and what were some different things that were cool things when we were younger. And it was cool just to talk together as a team and just like, oh, that's awesome. Oh yeah, I remember that toy. I played with that too. Or I remember those commercials or those shows on TV, and then trying to help us understand the culture today through that same lens. Like, these things had a huge role in our lives. They need to have, they played a similar role in the lives of our teenagers as well. And there's other times where training is very serious, like it's on a mental health issue that we really need to focus in on. Like if we have around the time where we had those, the suicides and the other, tragic deaths and everything. And so we leaned in then and did some training and preparing them around, suicide and other mental health issues and stuff like that. And so those trainings will vary, but for the most part, I've been pulling them from Leaning Upon Download Youth Ministry for that. And then for our planning time, we really just kind of look at the calendar ahead of time, like try to look at least a few weeks, if not several months ahead of time. So here's what we're planning. Here's the things that our staff has put in place that we feel pretty confident about, that we've maybe talked about in the past. And here's some plans we have in place. But here's some things that we're thinking about. What do you think? What if you were to do this? Is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? How can we add to this and make it better? And that way it gives them a lot more feedback. But at the same time, we know that not all that can be accomplished in just a 20-minute segment of a meeting. And so a lot of that is, hey, if you're interested in this, take a note, contact me later. And we've actually had several of our leaders that have kind of taken those opportunities and say, hey, you mentioned that you want to do this prayer circle or this prayer station thing in a couple weeks. I've got some awesome ideas for that. I'd love to sit down and talk with, over coffee. And all of a sudden, the next thing we know, she's the one leading the whole thing. And it was so much better than we could have ever imagined, because she was passionate about it and she ran with it. And then, we spent time praying together. I try to treat our small groups, leaders as a small group themselves, even though they're not very small. It's like 30 leaders. And so, but we try to just take some time just to, care for each other. Like not only pray for our students, which is incredibly important, but pray for each other, like what's going on in each other's lives and to try to stay active in that as well.
That's awesome. I know a lot of people are like you call it flip the classroom, give them the video content ahead of time, then talk about it. So kind of like do the teaching at home and do the homework, so to speak, or the discussion, together. I find people are using like trained-up.church and some of these video delivery systems to even build courses, which is great. But sometimes they run into the problem of people don't actually watch them. But see, you have that key piece that I think is needed. You talk about it. So there's this expectation that you're going to watch it. And if you don't watch it, hopefully you're probably not calling people out, but you're going to feel like I should have done this because now I can't contribute to the conversation, right? Because I didn't watch it. So it's like that healthy measure of accountability that is, if that's missing, I could see where people wouldn't get, their folks to watch some of the training stuff they send out. So that's good. Well, thanks for, walking us through that. I think that alone was helpful. We didn't even plan to talk about that, but that's a good, rhythm you have there for meeting and training with your volunteers. Well, Steve, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. How can people connect with you?
No problem. Thanks for having me. The biggest way, like I'm on social media, I'm pretty much on like every platform out there, but I'm very active on Twitter. I told a lot of our students and other people like, how do you use the different social media? I was like, I pretty much have Facebook for my family and for parents and interacting with them. Twitter is like my thing. So if you're also on Twitter, you can just follow me at Steve Cullum. So that's SteveCullum. And I'm also on Instagram as well. Not as active as on Instagram, but you can follow me on any of those places. I do have a blog where I'm talking about student ministry and other parts of my life at stevecullum.com. And make sure you check out the Student Ministry podcast as well. We're pretty much on all the different podcast apps out there. You can just search for the Student Ministry podcast or even my name and hear about all these awesome stories that I get to talk with other youth pastors about.
Awesome. Well, Steve, thanks so much for taking the time. Love the momentum that you're getting out there in Colorado. You probably love the views. That's awesome too. Even the weather is probably better in some ways than what you're dealing with out here. I enjoy that. Like winters were not gray, which was awesome. Yeah, I actually saw in the winter, it was weird, but it was cool. It was cool. It was weird. Well, I'm glad you're out there and you feel like it's a great fit. You and your wife still get to use that passion and training you have to help people with mental health issues. So that's excellent too. So thanks for coming on the podcast. This was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for all you do too.
Well, there you have it. That was some great information from Steve when we talked about what we were going to talk about on the podcast. And there was the topic of students' mental health and their passion surrounding that and their experience surrounding that. Definitely wanted to talk about that. And then also going from his church in New England to there in Colorado, very different churches, different sizes, having to build momentum. You know, he had started a ministry from scratch and then kind of building momentum in a ministry that existed for a while, but certainly had lost a lot of momentum. I wanted to talk about both things, even though they're very different and could almost be two different podcasts. But I hope you found that to be helpful. A few action items that I think about, action steps that you could take coming out of that podcast. One is to talk to some professionals in your community about mental health. Maybe it'll bring some more awareness, some knowledge on your behalf. And if I were you, and especially if you serve in student ministry, I would talk about middle school and high school students. Like, what does it look like for them? How are people helping? What could a church do? And then organize a training for students, parents, and leaders at your church, and maybe with those same professionals. In regards to what we talked about with the student ministry that he led out east and then in Colorado and how he's changed things there, one thing that stuck out to me that I think is a great practice, I learned the idea from someone, and I did that early on, and I always look back at that as one of the key things that helped our ministry. And that's what he is doing, where he's meeting with his key leaders monthly. That's a big commitment for sure. And in his case, it's his whole volunteer team because the way they're set up. But you could handpick 8, 10 people, 4 people, whatever it might be, and meet with them monthly and do like he did. Make the most of their time. Don't waste their time. Invest in them. Treat them in a sense, how you would want them to treat others if they lead other people on your team. And maybe they don't yet, and they didn't for me when I had this kind of a leadership team, as I called it. But eventually they did. Those people became coaches, and they were volunteers who led other volunteers. So I think that would be a great action step to take coming out of this podcast, along with a couple steps there to dive into how your church can help students who are going through mental health issues. For sure. You can get all the show notes. Steve emailed some things, some documents about crisis protocol and some other things that you'll want to check out. You can get all that at nickblevins.com/episode 107. So there we have it. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was helpful for you in your ministry. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode, and we'll be back next week. And until then, hope you have a great and productive week. See ya.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.